All right. Welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all at the Williams-Boston Association virtual annual meeting. This is an event that we normally host in person, but obviously not this year, but I'm still very happy to have everyone here. Just a couple of sort of housekeeping notes off the top here. Everyone is muted for the time being. We know you'll probably all have some questions for our keynote speaker, Michael. What we're going to do is, if you want to ask questions during Michael's talk, you can put them in the Zoom chat, and we will, when Michael is done with his talk, we'll answer the questions in the chat. We're also going to open up at the end. We'll allow folks to unmute themselves if you would rather ask a question verbally at the end. So you have two ways to ask questions if you have them, but you will remain muted until the Q&A portion. So we appreciate your understanding with that. And in case you didn't see it in the opening slide that was just shared, there's a subtitle feature on Zoom, which we're happy to have for folks who may need it. If you don't want subtitles on your screen at the bottom middle bar on your Zoom panel, there's an option to turn off the subtitles. So that's where you can do that if you so choose. So again, I want to welcome everyone to this event. This is an event that we look forward to every year. Again, usually it is in person. We usually gather at an event space. We usually have a cash bar and some appetizers and a keynote speaker. So I'm very happy to have the keynote speaker, even if we don't have the cash bar or the hors d'oeuvres. Hopefully next year we can get back to that, but this is an important event to the WBA. So we're thrilled to have Michael. I'm happy you're all here. I'm happy we can do an event like this, although it's not in person. This is also a time, an event where we recognize our board members, the Williams-Boston Association board. When we do this in person, usually those folks are there and they'll stand up and be recognized. Can't really do that on Zoom. So I'm just gonna say, I'll name them here. Some of them may be on this call, but Abby, Audrey, Don, Christoph, Ra, Ryan, and Tingda have all done awesome work this year. They've helped us put on a number of virtual events, including this one, and I just want to make sure that they're recognized. This is totally a volunteer organization, so the folks who are on the board are here because they love to help put on these kinds of events and love to help bring the Williams-Boston community together. And so I'm really appreciative of them and the work they do, and I'm sure you all are too. I just want to make sure that they're recognized for that. I also want to recognize Rob Swan, who has been our alumni relations contact through this challenging year and has helped us put on a lot of these virtual events through the Williams Office of Alumni Relations. He's behind the scenes of this event doing Zoom tech, and he has been extremely helpful. So I certainly want to thank him as well, because he's been instrumental helping us stand up a lot of our virtual programming. So thank you, Rob. And now I'll get to the real reason you're all here, which is our keynote speaker, Michael. So we're very excited to host New York Times bestselling author Michael Blanding, class of 1995, as our keynote speaker. Michael is an investigative journalist and writer for publications, including Wired, Slate, the Boston Globe, Boston Magazine, and the New York Times. He'll be discussing his new book, North by Shakespeare, a rogue scholar's quest for the truth behind the bard's work. The book follows an outsider's computer-assisted hunt to solve the mysteries behind the sources for Shakespeare's plays, leading him to the enigmatic 16th century courtier and translator, Thomas North. Welcome, Michael. I'll turn it over to you.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Ari, and thank you everyone for coming. It's really wonderful to be able to see you all. My book just launched last week, and I had a launch event, and it was a webinar format, and I couldn't see anyone, so I was just staring into a webcam the entire time. So it's nice to actually, feel like I'm actually standing before an audience here rather than just, alone in my dining room looking at a computer. And it's also really, such a pleasure to speak to a Williams audience, because I was realizing today that one of my first introductions to Shakespeare, first serious introductions to Shakespeare was at Williams. My first semester of my first year at Williams, I took a Shakespeare class, and I still have my Riverside Shakespeare textbook that still has all of my notes in it. And I actually referred to it as I was reporting this book. So, you know, in a real way, the legacy of Williams is living on in this book. And thanks again to Ari and to the Williams-Boston Association for inviting me to speak and to listen to what I have to say about the book that I just wrote. So I'm going to try and share my screen here. I'm not an expert at this, but I've been getting better. So just tell me if you cannot see this, but okay, you should all be seeing my slideshow now. So I am going to talk for about a half an hour. I'm going to give a presentation, just give you a little bit of an overview of the book. I've got a slideshow, and hopefully we'll make it entertaining. And then, as Ari said, we'll open up to questions in the end, and either drop them in the chat or ask them in person. And I'm really excited to talk about what I've presented. So obviously, we all know William Shakespeare as the writer of some of the greatest literature in the world, whether it is the wit of Falstaff or Beatrice, the heroism of Rosalind or Prince Hal, or the villainy of Richard III, Iago, or Lady Macbeth. Shakespeare has created indelible characters that have continued to influence us 400 years later. Even today, Shakespeare is being constantly reinterpreted, adapted, and parodied, and translated into every language around the globe. In fact, Shakespeare's 38 plays may be the closest that we have to a shared culture around the world. And it's been said that at every moment of every day, someone is performing Shakespeare somewhere in the world. And that's only been slightly less true during the pandemic, when Zoom Shakespeare has become a thing. And it's actually been quite good. The question that I ask in my book is, where do these stories come from that we all know through Shakespeare's plays? And on the one hand, the answer to that question is very easy. They come from William Shakespeare. He was born in 1564 and died in 1616. During his lifetime, he published half of the plays in quarto format. The other half were published after his death in the first folio. On the other hand, almost without exception, all of Shakespeare's plays come from stories that predate the plays. As Bill Bryson has said, Shakespeare is a wonderful teller of stories so long as someone else had told them first. Shakespeare's plays rely on Italian novellas, the chronicles of Holinshed and Hall, and the Roman biographies in Plutarch's Lives, among other sources. In fact, most scholars believe that Shakespeare used source plays for many of his works. And these plays, for the most part, have been lost, but we know some of them by name and by description. For example, Phoenicia, which some believe is an early version of Much Ado About Nothing, Philemon and Philistia, which may have inspired Two Gentlemen of Verona, Titus and Vespasian, which may have been an early version of Titus Andronicus, The Jew of Venice and The Merchant of Venice. Even Romeo and Juliet most likely had an earlier source play that's referred to in the text. And then there are what we might call companion plays that we do still have. These are texts of plays with similar names and similar plots to Shakespeare's plays. And scholars debate about whether they inspired Shakespeare, whether Shakespeare inspired them, or whether they were both inspired by now lost source plays. The scholar whom I profile in my book, Dennis McCarthy, believes that Shakespeare had a source play for nearly every single one of his dramas. Where he parts company with more conventional scholars, however, is that he believes they were all written by the same person, Sir Thomas North. Now, before you start heading for the exits and thinking that I am about to ply you with some crazy conspiracy theory, let me tell you that when Dennis first told me about this theory, I completely did not believe it. I was sort of vaguely aware of the idea that Shakespeare had not written the plays and that someone else, like the Earl of Oxford or Sir Francis Bacon, had written them. But I never really placed much stock in them. At the same time, you can understand why some people have those feelings about Shakespeare's plays and question how a glovemaker's son from Stratford-upon-Avon could write so adeptly about the court and the law and Italy and being a soldier at war and all of these experiences that, to the best of our knowledge, he never experienced in his own life. And as McCarthy started sending me more info about his belief about Thomas North in these source plays, it just started making more and more sense to me. I started actually looking at the evidence. It really started feeling compelling and provided this sort of middle ground between this Shakespearean orthodoxy and this anti-Stratfordian heresy that could explain how a lot of these elements got into the play without there being some sort of vast conspiracy theory that would rely upon, a number of people sort of secretly, writing these plays and passing them off under another name. And in fact, among the evidence that Dennis sent me was a manuscript that he had discovered in the British Library that no one had known about before. And he used computer software to determine that this manuscript was the source for 11 of Shakespeare's plays, including Richard III, Macbeth, and King Lear. And he wrote this up in a book in 2018 with his collaborator, Juneschluter, and many scholars accepted this, this belief that this was a source for Shakespeare's plays. And this manuscript was written by George North, who's a cousin of Thomas North. And of course, Dennis believes that Thomas used this source to write his plays, that Shakespeare didn't use it directly, but he didn't divulge that in this book. At the time, I wrote an article for the New York Times about this book, and it ended up on the front page of the Times under the headline, Plagiarism Software Unveils a New Source for 11 of Shakespeare's Plays. And it was very well received by both scholars and lay people alike. Though I think a lot of people were just secretly pleased that Shakespeare was revealed to be a plagiarist, which wasn't necessarily what the intent was. But I started to continue to follow McCarthy after this and started conceiving of this idea of writing a book that would go beyond just this one source and look in the totality of his theories about Thomas North and his relationship to the plays. Now, the first thing you need to know about Dennis is that he is not your ordinary classically trained scholar. In fact, he almost flunked out of high school, and he attended college, but dropped out a few credits shy of graduating. He was always very smart, though, and later in life, he started researching on his own, and he was particularly interested in science. And he started researching the way that plant and animal species move around the world, this field of study called biogeography. And he actually published in some academic journals on the subject, and culminated in this book, Here Be Dragons, which he wrote and was well reviewed in science and looked at as a really excellent resource in this field. And it was actually this book that sent him down the path of looking at Thomas North and Shakespeare's plays 15 years ago. After he had written Here Be Dragons and looked at how plant and animal species move around the world, he wondered if he could do the same thing with a story and look how a story moved around the world. And with sort of a maximum amount of hubris, he decided the story he would look at was Shakespeare's Hamlet. Now, Hamlet is based on a Norse legend that dates back to the medieval era. And it then appears in a French tale and finally appears in Shakespeare's first quarto in 1603. However, as McCarthy started looking into the topic, he discovered that there was actually another Hamlet that is referred to as early as 1589. And it's referred to as the Hamlet. And people believe that Shakespeare used this play in order to write his own. The text that refers to it is a romance called Menaphon, and it's in a preface to that text that this writer Thomas Nash talks about English Seneca And if you entreat him fair in a frosty morning, he will afford you whole Hamlets. And McCarthy started wondering who was this English Seneca that he was talking about as the writer of Hamlet. And so he started looking at other clues. And he talks about translators who vaunt Plutarch's plumes as their own. Now, North was most famously the translator of Plutarch's Lives, upon which Shakespeare based his Roman plays. And he talked about getting Boreas by the beard, and Boreas is the north wind. So, that also seemed to be a play on North's name. And so as McCarthy started looking into English Seneca and Thomas North, he found another reference in a much earlier work, which was a preface to Seneca's play Thyestes. And in this work, this writer, Jasper Heywood, was sort of recommending to other writers that they too translate Seneca. And he talked about going to the Inns of Courts, which were these Tudor law schools where many scholars were writing plays and translations at the time. And he particularly talks about going to Lincoln's Inn and finding the self-same North, whose dial doth of princes paint. And that, McCarthy found, was a reference to North's The Dial of Princes, which was a translation that he did at Lincoln's Inn of a Spanish work, which was sort of a manual for princes about kind of how to rule well. And as he started reading Dial of Princes, he found all of these references and quotes that sounded very familiar to him and seemed to be very similar to lines from Hamlet's famous soliloquy. I won't try to perform it, but as we know, Hamlet says, "To be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take up arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them." And in the Dial of Princes, North says, "Is it better that thou die or that thou escape and live, to be or not to be?" He talks about the assaults of life and broils of fortune, just like the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And he even talks about death as a kind of sleeping and a pilgrimage uncertain, just like Hamlet talks about death as a kind of sleeping and an undiscovered country. He even found a line in the Dial of Princes that had sleep, dream, and perchance all in the same line. And so he started putting it together and realizing that he could actually reconstruct all of Hamlet's soliloquy by similar passages in North's translation. And he looked all of these passages up on a database called Early English Books Online, EBO, and found that many of them were unique to Hamlet and Thomas North. So he started to believe that Thomas North was indeed English Seneca, and he wrote the Hamlet upon which Shakespeare based his work. As he started to do more research, however, he found numerous other references that seemed to tie North to other plays, like A Midsummer Night's Dream and Macbeth, and other texts that would sort of use these puns on North's names and then refer to characters in Shakespeare's plays. And finally, he found this text, Green's Grotesworth of Wit, which is sort of famous for calling Shakespeare an upstart crow, as many of you may have heard, and refers to a tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, which is a reference to a line in Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 3. And this playwright who's the only Shakes seen in the country. And so this is often taken as a reference to Shakespeare by both scholars and those who believe that Shakespeare didn't write the plays. And it seems to allude to the fact that Shakespeare at least one of his contemporaries believed that Shakespeare took his lines from other writers and tried to pass them off as his own. But most scholars do not look that much further into this text. But there's this whole sort of other passage in which it talks more specifically about this country actor, Shakes scene. And he has this conversation with this gentleman scholar in which he's very specifically talking about buying these plays. And he says, "Men of my profession get by scholars their whole living." And the gentleman scholar says, but how do you mean to use me? And the actor says, "Why, sir, in making plays for which you will be well paid." And so as McCarthy started reading this, he realized that he could be witnessing this sort of satirical recreation of Shakespeare buying these plays from Thomas North and adapting them for his own. And indeed, in the rest of this text, there's all these autobiographical details of this gentleman scholar that seem to match up very closely with North's life. So who is Thomas North? He was a gentleman who was raised at Kirtling Hall and lived in Tudor luxury for his childhood. His father, Edward, was very high in the reign in the court of Henry VIII. That's him in the lower left-hand corner. His brother, Roger, was also a lord who was a very well-known courtier in Queen Elizabeth's court. Thomas, however, was sort of disowned by his family and did not inherit any of the wealth, and sort of made his life as a translator, writing the Dial of Princes, Plutarch's Lives, and this other work called the Moral Philosophy of Donny, which is this sort of collection of animal fables, sort of like Aesop's fables. And he also had this sort of amazing life as this kind of 16th century zealot, where he was really part of most of the most important events of the age. And he was trained as a lawyer and a diplomat who traveled to France and Italy, and was a soldier who fought in Ireland and the Netherlands, and was a captain during the Spanish Armada. So he really fit the qualifications for writing the plots of Shakespeare's plays, much more than Shakespeare himself. However, towards the end of his life, he also suffered from extreme poverty, and for that reason, that may be one reason why he would sell these plays and for someone else to produce it towards the end of his life. There were also all of these events in Thomas North's life that really seemed to match up very closely with a lot of the events in the plays. In 1551, there was this notorious murder that occurred. I sort of start my book with this. It was this very dramatic murder in which Thomas North's half-sister, Alice Arden, murdered her husband with the help of her lover. And it was such a scandal in Tudor society that there was a play that was written about it 40 years later called Arden of Faversham. And this play is looked at as many people as one of Shakespeare's first works, even though it was published anonymously. There are many similarities with Macbeth, and much of the language in it seems very Shakespearean. And in fact, 3 years ago, it was actually dubbed by the Oxford Shakespeare as being by William Shakespeare and Anonymous. And that Anonymous is believed by McCarthy, at least, to be Thomas North. And that's because he took this play and he looked at the Dial of Princes, and again, he found even more common phrases between the two. He found actually thousands of common phrases between the two, many of which were incredibly rare. I'm just going to show you one in particular, which is the subtitle of Arden of Faversham, wherein is showed the great malice and dissimulation of a wicked woman. And in the Dial, there's a chapter heading that says, wherein is expressed the great malice and little patience of an evil woman. So there's just such a close correspondence between those two passages that it really can't be coincidence. In 1555, North went on a delegation to Rome, and he went to a strange church that had these lifelike wax statues. And then he went to this palace called the Palazzo Tay, in which he saw these amazing frescoes by the artist Giulio Romano of gods and goddesses in this sort of pagan feast. And in The Winter's Tale, it actually has the only Renaissance artist that's mentioned in Shakespeare's work, which happens to be Giulio Romano. And it also features a lifelike statue that comes alive at the end of the play, which is said to have been made by Giulio Romano. And additionally, in that play, there's this pastoral feast that has many of the same gods and goddesses that were in this fresco in the Palazzo Tay. And some scholars have even pointed to the Palazzo Tay as the source for The Winter's Tale, but they can't explain how Shakespeare would have known about it at that time, or even known the name Giulio Romano. However, McCarthy was able to find another document, a manuscript journal that Thomas North wrote about his travels through France and Italy, including a description of this church and this palace, which is one of the only surviving examples of an Englishman who wrote about this church in the 16th century. And he and Schluter wrote another work in which they transcribed the journal and wrote about some of these connections. That was also just published this past year. Most of the elements in the play that McCarthy identified, though, had not to do with North's own life, but the life of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who was North's patron and actually is who he dedicates some of his works to. Now, the Earl of Leicester was a longtime companion of Queen Elizabeth, and he spent 40 years trying to woo her and win her hand in marriage. And it was really the most important question of the day in Elizabethan England was, who was Elizabeth going to marry, and would it be Leicester? In 1575, he held an incredible festival at his castle in Kenilworth, which lasted for 19 days. And people consumed 40 barrels of wine a day. And some scholars look at this as one of the inspirations for Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. There were also examples that McCarthy found of foreign suitors that seemed to be referred to obliquely in the play. So Leicester was sort of famous not only for trying to woo Elizabeth on his own behalf, but also trying to prevent her from marrying anyone else. And one of the tactics that he used was using other writers like Philip Sidney and Edmund Spenser to write tracts against these other suitors. And McCarthy believes that Thomas North, who was in that same circle, was doing the same thing with his plays. For example, on the left there, that's Eric XIV of Sweden. McCarthy believes that Titus Andronicus is actually written as sort of a warning to Elizabeth not to marry him. In Titus Andronicus, there's a Roman emperor who marries this Goth queen, and sort of disaster ensues on many levels. And Eric of Sweden was also king of the Goths. It was king of Sweden and the Goths. There's a direct correlation there. That handsome gentleman in the middle is Don John of Austria, who is the bastard brother of King Philip II of Spain. And in Much Ado About Nothing, the villain of that play is Don John the Bastard. And on the right, that charming young man is Hercule Francois, the Duke of Alençon, who was a longtime suitor for Queen Elizabeth throughout many years. And McCarthy believes that many of the anti-French sentiments in the plays could be traced to trying to dissuade Elizabeth from marrying Alençon, including a ancestor of Alençon in Henry VI, Part 1, who is sort of presented as this sort of cowardly character who's bested by the English hero Talbot, who is an ancestor of the Earl of Leicester. And so you could sort of saw that playing out in the play the same way it was playing out in life. And the reason that scholars have not really identified any of these figures, even though a lot of these references seem very obvious, is that in Shakespeare's time, Don John and Alençon were both dead, and King Eric had gone mad. And so there would have been no reason for him to write about these figures. But of course, in these earlier plays by Thomas North, they would have been very relevant as sort of objects of derision. I won't go into Thomas North's entire life and how McCarthy sees it in the plays, but just to mention one more brief example, as he started looking more deeply into Hamlet, he actually started to believe that it was written by North in 1588. Remember, the Hamlet was referred to in 1589. And may actually relate to Thomas North's position as a captain during the Spanish Armada, in which he almost died when he was faced a real, almost certain death. And of course, Hamlet is consumed with the thoughts of death and the meditation on death throughout the whole play. And if you look at Hamlet, there's all these references to sort of an invasion coming from the sea, and all these sort of strange portents that also sort of may apply to the Spanish Armada. And those have been recognized by scholars. In addition to looking at Thomas North's life in the plays, however, McCarthy also continued his computer research, and he started using this plagiarism software called WCopyFind. And he took the entire text of Thomas North's translations and the entire text of Shakespeare's plays, and he basically started looking to see if he could find common phrases that appeared in both, as evidence that Thomas North had sort of plagiarized himself in these early plays that were then adapted by Shakespeare. Now, as I've said, it's very well known that the Roman plays are all based on Thomas North's Plutarch's Lives, but it's really amazing when you look at them side by side and just see, you can see all the words in red there are common words between these two passages. And it's just one passage of many in Antony and Cleopatra. They're drawn directly from North. Plots, characters, even a lot of the descriptions and soliloquies seem to be drawn directly out of North's Plutarch. And that's not only the same for Antony and Cleopatra, it also applies to Julius Caesar and Coriolanus. But it wasn't just the Roman plays in Plutarch that McCarthy started finding evidence of Thomas North's work in the plays, but he started finding it for almost every play in the canon and from all three of Thomas North's translations. And I realize you can't really see this very closely, but you can check it out on Dennis's websites or thomasnorth.com if you're interested. But I just wanted to show you the number of passages that he found that seemed directly drawn from Thomas North's work. And it wasn't just common phrases that he found, but it was actually whole passages that had the same meaning in Thomas North's work and Shakespeare's plays and seemed to be presented in the same context. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of this, to show you just some instances of the many examples that Dennis found. But in addition to these passages that seem to be in both the plays and the translations, they also seem to appear right around the same time that Thomas North would have been writing these translations in his life. So for example, in 1570, Thomas North wrote this translation, The Moral Philosophy of Donny. And his biographers speculate that he went to Italy in the year before to get this translation, which was published in Venice. And now in 1569 in Venice, that's when the Turks invaded. And that is actually the backdrop and the setting for Shakespeare's Othello. And McCarthy found many correspondences between this text and Othello, which is sort of strange because it is this, as I said, collection of animal fables. And there's one sort of main fable, which is deals with this sort of villainous mule who wants to take over the kingdom. And he is going to turn this bull against this lion who's sort of the ruler of the kingdom. And in this text, in an early scene, he talks about, he's talking to his confidant, the ass, and he says, some animals are just content with their provender, with this sort of coarse animal feed, but that's not me. I'm going to, I want richer food and I want to, earn promotion at court. And he's really upset about being passed over for this promotion. And an almost identical scene happens in the early scenes of Othello, in which the villain Iago is confiding to his confidant Rodrigo, and he uses the same language. He says that some men are content to serve like an ass for naught but provender. And then he says, I'm not going to write all my thoughts on my forehead. And the mule in Donny says, I'm not going to wear my heart upon my sleeve. And I'm sorry, the mule says, I will not write my thoughts. And Iago says, I will not wear my heart upon my sleeve. The mule says, tell me not of honesty or dishonesty. Tut, a fig. Iago says, virtue, a fig. 'Tis in ourselves that we are thus or thus. The mule talks about committing a double treason against the bull and the lion. Iago talks about a double knavery against Othello and his lieutenant Cassio, who he's going to turn against Othello. And the mule even talks about leading the bull by the nose, and Iago talks about leading Othello by the nose, as asses are. So there's this direct correspondence between these two texts that just seems like it cannot be coincidence. Now, of course, one explanation for this is that Shakespeare was just a big fan of Thomas North, and he used the Roman Plutarch for the Roman plays, and he used the Moral Philosophy of Donny for other plays. There's a problem with that, though, in some passages like this next one I'm going to show you from Richard II. And in this passage, one of the characters talks about grief and talks about it as seeing like through water in which everything is distorted. And then she uses this really strange phrase about dissolving the bands of this life. And in North's translation, Nepo's Lives, which is the sort of follow-up to Plutarch's Lives, he talks about the same phenomenon where grief is seen through water, and he uses the same language of dissolving the bands of this life. However, Richard II was published in 1597, 5 years before Nepo's Lives. So there's no way that Shakespeare could have taken this directly from North. He would have had to have, North's private papers, for example, or McCarthy's right that North used this to write a play that Shakespeare then adapted. So in writing this book, I just want to tell you a little bit about writing the book before I close and answer questions. But, as I started conceiving about this book as a way to reveal McCarthy's theories to the world, I didn't want to just sit across from the table from him and have a conversation for 16 chapters. I thought that would be really boring. So I decided I would travel with him and go to some of these places that Thomas North saw and see how they would relate to the plays. And as luck would have it, his daughter is a documentary filmmaker, and she was working on a film about her dad. And so we sort of joined forces, and Dennis and me and Nicole, his daughter, and these camera people traveled in England and France. And it just made it so much a richer experience to be going to these places together. And I can write about it very entertainingly in the book about these travels we took together and sort of how that unfolds the plays. There we are at Kenilworth Castle. There we are at Kirtling Hall. We were technically not supposed to be at Kirtling Hall, but I assure you that's public land that we were standing on in that picture there. There we are at the Palazzo Tay in that strange church I told you about in Mantua. And you can see the delight on Dennis's face. He actually had never even been to this palace before, even though he'd been working on Thomas North for 15 years. He'd never actually seen it in person. So it was really just so dramatic. It's, you know, the experience of being there, you feel like you're at this feast yourself. You can see how it could, you know, lend itself to a play. Of course, we had to go to Venice and look for traces of the Merchant of Venice and Othello. There's me with a very picturesque gondola at the Bridge of Sighs. There's Dennis along the bridge Dennis along the Grand Canal, and Nicole and her cameraman Ian on the Rialto Bridge. And then in addition to going on these travels with Dennis, I also did a lot of my own research in the archives in England. I didn't want to just take his word for it and just, you know, assume that what he was saying was right. I wanted to kind of test it with my own research. And in a very uncanny way, a lot of the things that I found in the archives ended up really corroborating a lot of Dennis's theories. These are some documents at the National Archives that Dennis didn't even know about Thomas North's father, Edward, that seemed to corroborate some of his ideas about the play Henry VIII. Here's a copy of North's own Dial of Princes at Cambridge University Library. And you know, if I have one criticism of Dennis, it is that he's an excellent scholar when it comes to the computer, but he didn't actually go and look at a lot of these documents in person. So I had the pleasure of actually looking at this document in person. And again, it seemed to really, I seem to find many things that sort of bore out Dennis's theory. And you can see in this copy of the Dial of Princes, you can see this is Thomas North's own marginalia. That's his signature at the top there. And then there were all of these things that he wrote or underlined in the text that seemed to correspond to things that Dennis had already found. For example, you can see this subheading from Arden of Faversham, the great malice and little patience of an evil woman, that Thomas North himself had underlined and written in the margin. And then there seemed to be all these references to Macbeth. Like he talked about these strange foods like lizards and broth and fried frogs that seemed called to mind the witch's brew in the beginning of Macbeth. And he even talked about the condition of a wicked man who was compared to a candle, which really called to mind to me Macbeth's final soliloquy, out, brief candle. And in fact, you know, even though Dennis had not known about these references in the Dial of Princes, he had independently determined that that Thomas North had written a source play for Macbeth in 1591. So, you know, it's hard to say, you know, is this just confirmation bias on my part seeing this stuff, or is there really something there? I'm just going to finish up here. I just wanted to give a shout out to Juneschluter, who is Dennis's co-author and collaborator in all of this research. And she is a Shakespearean scholar herself. She was the editor of a publication called Shakespeare Bulletin. And she looked at the evidence that Dennis had amassed, and she, you know, at first needed some convincing, but as she saw the totality of his work, she really began to believe it herself. And as I said, started collaborating with him and also teaching him how to write for a more scholarly audience and sort of get his ideas across in a way that other people could hear it. As may not surprise you, though, for the most part, mainstream scholars have not embraced Dennis's work. They have, you know, anything that sort of smacks of this idea that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare is, you know, real anathema to Stratfordian orthodoxy. But I think it's a really fascinating middle way, as I said, that can explain a lot about Shakespeare's plays without sort of resorting to these conspiracy theories. And for that reason, I really think that it it deserves a closer look, and that's why I wrote my book, to really bring it to people's attention. And I invite you to read the book, to look at Dennis's website, make up your own mind about it, draw your own conclusions. But I really thank you for taking the time to listen to me and to hear me talk about this journey.
All right, thank you so much, Michael. We are going to open it up to questions. So in a second, I'll allow folks to unmute themselves. I am going to take a liberty here and ask the first question, though, if folks don't mind. So Michael, I think like a lot of people, I first encountered Shakespeare really in high school English class.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about that experience and how you're not, when I was learning it, these sorts of things might have been alluded to, that Shakespeare, may or may not have written original works. But do you think, as you've really studied this, do you think this should change, how Shakespeare is taught, or should more context be given when students are first sort of discovering this material?
Well, what's really fascinating is that there has been a real movement in Shakespearean studies in the last, certainly the last decade, if not the last several decades, to look more closely at the works as collaborative works, and to not look at Shakespeare as this sort of, unique genius who wrote the plays all on his own, but to look at the contribution of other writers, and even use some of these computer techniques that Dennis has used to, speculate that Shakespeare may have written these plays with Christopher Marlowe or Thomas Kidd or these other writers. And, it's sort of changing our conception of the theater in Elizabethan England to one in which, almost like sort of screenwriters and directors today, where there's kind of multiple hands working on a project, and it's not just sort of one person that writes it and then it's published and then it's going to get set down in stone. So I think, for that reason alone, I think that Shakespeare should be taught that way. And I think, given those kind of considerations, I think it very plausible that Shakespeare, we know Shakespeare was adapting some of these source plays, and I think it's plausible that that Dennis is right, that many, if not the bulk of these source plays, were written by this other writer.
Yeah, I wish I had known more in high school, more of what I know now. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem, is that so many people are sort of subjected, to Shakespeare in high school and end up with an aversion to him. But, I had the pleasure of reading and rereading a lot of the plays in writing this book, and it really is wonderful to come back to later in life and have more life experience and just see the beauty and the storytelling in these plays.
All right. Well, folks, you can now unmute. So if anyone else would like to ask questions, please go ahead and unmute and go for it.
Is it okay if I just jump in, Ari?
Yeah, go ahead.
Michael, thank you. This is a new view. Two questions, really. North was a translator, but clearly he was a creative writer himself. Has the researcher gone backwards from North to see what he took from his sources? Question A. And question B, although Shakespeare's a great playwright, he's also a great poet. Has he done the same thing with any of the poetry?
Yeah. In terms of the sources, what's fascinating is that, we all know Plutarch and sort of how that gave the plots of the Roman plays. But to look at these other sources like the Dial of Princes and the Moral Philosophy of Dani, they were these real kind of humanist works that even the Moral Philosophy of Dani, even though it was a bunch of animal fables, they were all about sort of these allegories about kind of how rulers should rule. And so all of his translations in one form or another were obsessed with this idea of what makes a good ruler, what makes a virtuous ruler, what makes a bad ruler, and what makes, an evil ruler. And so when you look at these sources, they really, they add a lot of interest to the plays, the Roman plays, the English histories, but even some of the other plays, the comedies, interpreting them through this lens of that sort of obsessed North his whole life and about what makes a ruler. And then the other thing that McCarthy looked into quite a bit was what other sources North might have used based on the sources that we know Shakespeare used for the plays. And one thing that was really uncanny is that so a lot of the sources that Shakespeare used, these Italian novellas, for example, or the English histories, they're all much older sources than the established dates of the plays. So it'll be established that Shakespeare will have written a play in the 1580s, but he keeps using these sources from like the 1560s or the 1570s. And so McCarthy's belief is that it would have made a lot more sense for Shakespeare to use the more updated sources, but it would make perfect sense for North to be using these older sources if he was writing the play as older. I hope I explained that well. But so it sort of adds additional credence to his theory. And then finally about the poetry, this is one criticism of Dennis's theory to say, well, how could the poetry of Shakespeare's plays be written by this translator, this prose translator North? And you see this a lot in a lot of the prefaces to Antony and Cleopatra or Julius Caesar. They'll say, Shakespeare was the brilliant genius who took Thomas North's prose and turned it into poetry, and they give him credit for that. But one of the things that McCarthy has done, and he's actually just starting to do now, is look more closely at some of these translations and find instances where North is actually writing blank verse poetry that's not in the source material. It's not in the Italian. It's not in the Spanish. He sort of took the foreign material and actually translated it into English, but he did it in blank verse poetry. So that's work he's just starting to do now, and starting to actually find some of the poetry in these translations that could sort of imply that he had the poetic skill as well.
If anyone else would like to ask questions, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Michael. This is Alan Stern from the class of '67, up here in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, where the broadband sucks. So if I freeze in the middle of my sentence, you'll understand why. And I'm
okay.
hoping we get rural broadband at some point in the next sentence.
Right.
My question has to do with, was it common for other authors of the time to use sources like Shakespeare is supposed to have used? Is he the only one that did this, or was everybody doing it?
There were certainly other authors who were doing this, who were using these older sources, whether they were these, Italian plays or French sources, or even sort of English, English fables and things are working in the plays. Shakespeare's particularly known for doing this. I mean, one of the interesting things about Shakespeare is that a lot of, other playwrights of the period were writing plays about sort of London life, things that were going on, characters that would be sort of commonplace in London at the time. And with very few exceptions, like the Merry Wives of Windsor, Shakespeare's plays are all about these other topics that, these other things that are happening in other places. And half of them are set in Italy and are drawn from these Italian stories. And so again, it's one of these questions that, causes people to ask, why, if Shakespeare wrote the plays, why isn't he writing about the things that, that come from his experience like other playwrights are? Why is he so obsessed with these other foreign sources?
I just ask about the any financial arrangements between Shakespeare and North, or how did North end up being so poor? If he was writing these books, they just didn't sell, or I don't know how wealthy Shakespeare was in the end. He didn't help out his collaborator.
Well, Shakespeare was pretty wealthy by the end, which was he was more of an impresario, and he had this company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men. Whereas, as you can imagine, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Writers were not very well paid in Elizabethan times. I forget the exact figures, but I think a new play would go from, between £1 and £3. Even though that was a lot more at the time, it wasn't that much more. And to license an older play was like 40 shillings or something like that. So, you see these instances in which Thomas North was actually paid by his brother, Roger North, in connection with this other company, Leicester's Men, which is the Earl of Leicester's Men, and he would pay the Earl of Leicester's Men, and he would also pay Thomas North 40 shillings on the same line. And so, there's some evidence that North was actually paid for plays, even though we don't have any of these plays. I mean, they're all lost if indeed they ever existed. But you can imagine another arrangement like that with Shakespeare, where he would have just paid him, a few pounds per play, taken them, and then he could kind of do whatever he wanted with them. He could adapt them, he could revise them, he could put his own name on them legitimately and legally, and there was nothing that could be done about it. So it would make sense in terms of the economy of the theater at the time.
There were no copyright laws back then, I guess.
Not really. No, I mean, there were some instances in which people sued other writers for plagiarism, but the whole concept of plagiarism, even the word plagiarism, didn't exist until 1598, and so it was much more of this kind of society where if you took a story and you wrote it and you made it your own, you could put your name on it, and so. It wouldn't require some conspiracy theory where Thomas North was writing these plays kind of behind the scenes. Shakespeare could legitimately buy them and adapt them and put his name on them.
Michael, would it have been common knowledge at the time that this was going on? And if so, would no one else have written about it?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. And the way I understand it, or at least the way Dennis understands it, and the way I've sort of also understood it from reading books about the time, is that as a gentleman, North really wouldn't have wanted to be associated with playwriting. It was a very sort of low-born art, and he would have seen the translations as his kind of legacy, Plutarch and all of that. And the theater at the time wasn't seen as this kind of great literary pursuit that we see it today. It was more just sort of entertainments at court and for the masses. And so that's one that he wouldn't have necessarily wanted to be associated with it as a gentleman, whereas most of the playwrights at the time were from the merchant class. The other really interesting aspect, though, is that I show you those few examples in the beginning, like Thomas Nash sort of alluding to the plays, and Thomas North and the Grotesworth of Wit, in which it seems like he's talking about possibly someone selling these plays to Shakespeare. And Dennis has found dozens of these references that all sort of, they either pun on North's name or they refer to kind of a caricature of North, and they talk about this sort of impoverished Italian knight or something. And then they make references, they insert a line of Shakespeare, or they make a reference to one of the plays. And you could see, you could say maybe you're just reading into these texts what you want to see, but there's so many of them, and they're so in some ways, they're so explicit that it seemed like there were people that knew about this at the time and were sort of making fun of it and mocking Shakespeare for not writing his own plays, and mocking North for sort of being this old antiquated kind of writer of these old forms. And so if you believe that, then people were writing about it, people were acknowledging North's authorship, but it just wasn't public, and there's no known references to North as a playwright.
I do think we have time. Oh,
What's
sorry.
next for you?
Go ahead.
Oh, that's a good question. It's always the question that writers dread. I have a few ideas for our next book, but nothing set in stone yet. So I'll certainly let the Williams community know when I do.
We have time, if someone wants, we have time for one more question. If there is one.
No, I think you've just left us all stunned and speechless.
Yeah, fair
Well,
enough.
I'll just say one more thing, which is a question some people ask me about this book, and which I should have mentioned during the presentation, but you know, some people ask sort of, why does this matter? You know, like, does it really matter whether Thomas North or William Shakespeare or the Earl of Oxford or, you know, whoever wrote the plays? The plays are the plays. They're these works of genius that have been adapted through the centuries. And I could say for me, engaging with this theory over the last few years and rereading the plays with this in mind has really changed and deepened and in many ways enriched my experience of the plays. And, you know, in some mundane ways, just like thinking about, you know, the Winter's Tale as an allegory for Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon, or you know, these references to these suitors of Queen Elizabeth, you know, that you can find in the plays, like I discussed. But in a more profound way, you know, to think of Hamlet written as somebody who was sort of facing his own mortality at the time, or King Lear written by someone who was impoverished at the time and who, you know, really faced sort of banishment from his family, or Henry V, you know, which we think of this sort of, you know, pro-war play being written by someone who was actually experiencing war at the time and who was, you know, having a hard time of it and actually inserting more negative impressions of war that you can read in the play at the same time. And so it's really kind of changed and enlivened my understanding of the plays. And I think that, you know, to your question, Ari, about, you know, how Shakespeare should be taught, I think that, you know, teaching in this way and sort of, you know, being open to this possibility could really change the way that people teach Shakespeare in the future.
Yeah, I definitely think, I already feel like just from this program, I already, you know, want to revisit these things, and it's definitely intriguing. So,
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael, for being with us and for sharing your expertise with us. It was really enjoyable and really interesting. Folks, you can see here on the screen some upcoming virtual events, including, I'll sort of selfishly point out the WBA event, the fourth event from the top here. We have a lunch and learn series that we try to put on at least once a month. We have one coming up on April 16th. You can also see there's a few other exciting events here, a bicentennial medalist event coming up on April 14th. If you want more information about all of the Williams virtual programming, you can go to alumni.williams.edu/virtual, and you'll find information on these events listed here, as well as others that are upcoming. I also want to say, if you look to the chat, Rob just posted, if you're interested in acquiring Michael's book, we put some links there so that you can go look directly to Michael's book and purchase it. So if you're interested in that, please go to the chat and you'll find those links there. And so once again, thank you to Michael for presenting tonight. Thank you to Rob for the technical help, and thank you to everyone for joining us. It was great to be able to do this. It was very interesting. It was great to gather together. So thank you all, and I hope to see you at an event sometime soon.
Thank you everyone again for listening to my presentation.